Hi everyone, welcome back to another video of counseling and virtual care. We are still looking at counseling approaches. In this particular video, we'll be focusing on psychoanalysis. So one of the biggest and most, iconic perspectives to doing counseling or psychotherapy. There's a lot of information about psychoanalysis out there, and not only Freudian psychoanalysis, the classical psychoanalysis, but also what is called neoclassical. And there's a lot of new people coming to the forefront and talking about psychoanalysis and adjusting and adapting psychoanalysis. So much like previous videos, this is a condensed version of what psychoanalysis is. We are covering the main topics, the main themes, the main ideas. My advice is, once more, I will put a few links or we'll talk about some resources throughout the video for you to expand your knowledge. There will be a lot to expand on. You can actually do a whole certification in psychoanalysis if this is what you are interested in, but we will discuss some interesting concepts. I hope you enjoy this content, and here we go. In this video, we'll focus on psychoanalysis. This is arguably the first approach to psychotherapy, but it's still widely used in today's practice. Here we have a quick reminder of some of the therapeutic approaches we are considering in this unit, but let's focus on the man on the top left with a serious and almost scary face, and that's Sigmund Freud. Freud was born in Moravia in 1856. He studied medicine and gained respect as a neurologist. In the early stages of his career, he started working with Jean-Martin Charcot, and he researched hysteria. This is a common term usually applied to women at that time, referring to an emotional disorder and inability to respond adequately to a certain situation. For example, someone may develop a twitch, selective mutism, paralysis, and similar somatic and dissociative reactions, and that was considered hysteria. Now, interestingly, hysteria comes from the Greek language and means uterus. So we can see how there was some subjectivity applied to the term and the condition. And this was in relation to how prevalent this was among women, but not men. Now, fortunately, these ideas have evolved a lot over the time, and now we don't think that these presentations are a condition seen only in women, and we're a little bit more, unbiased about this. In the 1890s, Freud started to gather evidence supporting his idea of the unconscious mind. But finally, in 1915, he published arguably the most iconic paper in psychotherapy, where Freud talked about the unconscious. We will discuss the idea of unconscious in the coming slides, but I wanted to give you a brief idea of how important this was for psychotherapy. Freud also published Beyond the Pleasure Principle. This is a paper where he presented the structure of the mind, consisting of the id, ego, and superego. And you might have heard about these terms, so that gives you a sense of how popular this idea was in the past and still has been throughout the history of psychotherapy. So let's now look at Freud's metapsychology. The word metapsychology refers to abstract theoretical models that together provide a general explanation of psychological life. In other words, it involves a series of theoretical explanations to describe what the mind looks like and how does it operate. In this case, Freud's metapsychology consisted of a topographic view of the mind, and this includes the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. And we should remember that topography is the study of maps and land surfaces, and Freud used this word topography because he believed he was mapping the mind to understand it a little bit better. His metapsychology also involved a structural aspect of the mind consisting of what I was mentioning before, the ego, id, and superego. The structures functioned either at a conscious or unconscious level. Once he mapped the mind and identified its structures, Freud saw a dynamic conflict and tension between opposing instinctual motives and these structures, and the battle was given between repressing or expressing the instinctual motives. And here, by instinctual motives, we mean wishful thinking, desires, fantasies, and so on. That is why he called this approach psychodynamic, because there is a dynamic friction or tension caused by the psychic energy residing in each one of us and is trying to find an outlet, whether being repressed or expressed. And that is why Freud's metapsychology involved an economic aspect of the mind, where psychic life powered by instinctual energy could be invested or directed into objects or activities, or it could be displaced or redirected if the intention is not socially sanctioned. For example, if the instinctual drive is to be aggressive and one wants to hurt someone, the psychic energy will have to be displaced or withdrawn because hurting someone is not okay. So you see this idea of the dynamic tension between expressing or repressing this psychic energy. Now, the Freudian view of human nature is deterministic. And this is because our conscious freedom is restricted by the influence of past experiences, irrational forces, unconscious motivations, and instinctual drives as we move through the psychosexual stages. It's almost as if we are prisoners of our own childhood experiences, or what I was mentioning before, the influence of our past experiences. So the idea is, according to Freud, is that who we are and what we do is pretty much determined, that is why deterministic, by what happened to us while we were growing up. And Freud believed that we could only gain insight into our unconscious motivation to learn how to live a less neurotic life, but our conditioned existence would be largely determined for us. It's a little bit pessimistic or maybe nihilistic view of human nature. That's Freud for you. Now let's look at instincts. Freud believed that people were ruled by two primary forces expressed psychologically as innate drives to action. These primary forces are the instincts. And according to Freud, these are hardwired into each and every one of us, leading us to act in a certain way to either fulfill or repress these instinctual wishes. These two instincts or forces are life and death instincts. Life instinct, also called eros, serves human survival, growth, development, and connection with others. The goal of life instinct is to gain pleasure and avoid pain. Freud also referred to eros as sexual instinct. And if you think about it, it makes sense to think that sexual activity is related to human survival, connection with others, and pleasure. Now, the second instinct is the death instinct, or thanatos. The death instinct is oriented towards the extinction of discomfort and suffering inherent in living. Here, in the death instinct, the association is with expressing psychic energy through aggression. If the aggression is oriented outwards, the death instinct is manifested through the wish of hurting someone. Alternatively, if the aggression is oriented inwards, the death instinct is manifested through the wish of hurting oneself or die. And the sexual and aggressive drives associated with the death and life instincts are always in conflict and are powerful determinants of our behavior. Okay, so far we've been talking a little bit about aggression and sexual tension in terms of the instinctual wishes and drives. Now let's look at the unconscious mind. Freud's greatest contribution was to develop a systematic theory of the unconscious and its relationship with conscious psychic functioning. He developed this model because he wanted to account for the coexistence of rationality and irrationality in our behavior. And that's funny because it's so true. Sometimes we can be so rational and sometimes we can be so irrational and with no apparent explanation. So He developed this model because he was wondering why we are so blind to our real motives and feelings and so prone to self-deception. And how can we so easily self-deceive if we have capacity for self-reflection and introspection? And the way he found to explain that irrationality and perhaps ambivalence between being rational and irrational is through the unconscious. So the unconscious are repressed experiences, memories, feelings, and instinctually based motivations that have been banished, pushed aside from conscious awareness and are out of our conscious control. In other words, the unconscious is made up of psychic content made inaccessible through the process of repression or moving all this psychic content outside of our awareness. And it may sound like a lot, but the idea is that all the stuff that we really want to do and we can't do because it's not okay, it's being pushed aside of our daily functioning, it's being pushed aside of our conscious awareness and is bagged into this unconscious mind. Now, the unconscious cannot be directly observed, but only inferred from disruptions to the consciously intended behavior. And that's exactly why Freud said that the unconscious is, by definition, unknowable. However, there are many times where our behavior is not what we intended, and this was used by Freud as evidence of the existence of the unconscious. For example, dreams. Freud saw dreams as manifestations of unconscious needs, wishes, and conflict. And you may have experienced something like this. Sometimes we dream about our most hidden fears or inappropriate fantasies. For example, it may be that in your dream you're murdering someone you really hate in real life. And of course, killing is wrong. So that impulse is pushed out of our conscious awareness into our unconscious. But it remains there and sometimes emerges. Another example of the emergence of the unconscious is slips of the tongue. Another way of saying slips of the tongue is parapraxis. This could be something like forgetting a familiar name. Or it could be when we want to say something but we say something else. For example, you may say mum to your partner by mistake. And you can see how there can be a lot to unpack from a psychoanalytic perspective when you call your partner mum or dad by mistake. Freud also saw evidence of the unconscious in free association and transference. Both of these concepts are psychoanalytic techniques, which we'll discuss in a few slides. But quickly, free association basically is when people lower their defenses and start moving from one topic to another to the point where they talk about something that they had been repressed or pushed outside of the conscious awareness. For example, it may be that people may not have a recollection of a memory of psychological abuse, but once they start talking and lowering their defenses, they may reach to a point of talking about something as traumatic as that. Another example of the evidence of the unconscious is somatization. Somatization are bodily symptoms that have no apparent physiological origin and can be evidence of repressed material. For example, unexpressed anger may be manifested in the form of a sore throat. Another really interesting example of the unconscious is repetition compulsion. Repetition compulsion is an inadvertent but repetitive pattern of self-destructive behavior. This sometimes can be seen in relation to the victims of abuse. They tend to relive some aspects of their traumatic experiences without knowing they're doing it. For example, I remember I had a client who always sought partners who would hurt her, either physically or emotionally. But she didn't realize she was always falling for the same type of guys and was engaging in this repetition compulsion. Finally, another interesting evidence of the unconscious is in the form of resistance or defensive evasion of experience. For example, one of my clients experiences panic attacks because he worries about his little brother, but he doesn't acknowledge his worries and doesn't see worrying about his brother as an issue, and doesn't want to talk about that in therapy, and instead he wants to talk about sports and other trivial things. Freud also compared the unconscious mind to an iceberg, where the tip of the iceberg, or the part that is above the water, is seen as the conscious mind, or the mental activity that we are aware of and we know about. The conscious mind also includes logic, rationality, and who we think we are and how we present ourselves. The second layer of the iceberg is called the preconscious. And this is where we may have access if we really focused on it. These include something like memories and stored knowledge. But finally, the deeper layer is the unconscious. And this is made of things we are not aware of and cannot freely access. These include things like fears, unacceptable desires, violent motives, irrational wishes, immoral urges, selfish needs, and shameful or traumatic experiences. So you can see how the material in the unconscious is usually not appropriate, shameful, or maybe too painful. All these thoughts and wishful thinking ends up repressed or pushed out of our conscious mind because we can't act on it. For example, we may forget we were bullied in primary school because it's too shameful or painful to remember, and there's not a lot we can do about that. So it's being pushed out of our conscious awareness into the unconscious. Now, Freud called the unconscious mind dynamic. So why do we think he used the word dynamic? This is because, once more, the conscious, preconscious, unconscious continuum is fluid and unstable. The limits of what is outside of our conscious awareness changes as some elements of our experience may be repressed and pushed into our unconscious. Whereas repressed elements may emerge into our conscious awareness through dreams or slip of a tongue and may catch our attention. So we can see the dynamic movement between all three layers of the mind. Now, the self-ignorance evident in unconscious processes is not accidental but motivated. Repression, the prototype of all offensive activity, is active and purposeful self-deception. Through this inadvertent repression and self-deception, experiential material can be continuously pushed into the unconscious. So this idea of self-ignorance is not that happens just because. It's not that happens just by chance. There is a process where the self-ignorance is almost sought. However, the repressed always threatens to erupt into conscious awareness and must be kept out of awareness through ongoing defensive activity. In other words, the lower parts of the iceberg are always threatening to emerge to the surface and become visible. For example, we may wish to hurt someone, but we repress that instinctual drive because it's inappropriate to hurt people. And yet, when we see that person, we may get frustrated, anxious or nervous because our instinctual wish of hurting that person comes crawling back. But we know it's wrong to hurt, so we push it back again. And we see the idea of the dynamic movement of the different structures or different parts of the mind again in play. Now let's look at the structure of personality. According to Freud, personality is not unified but comprises three systems experienced as semi-autonomous parts of the self. And these three parts are the id, the ego, and the superego. The id presents itself at birth and is ruled by the pleasure principle. It's guided by instincts, never matures, and is largely unconscious. In a way, the id is the inner child we all carry, but with negative connotations. It's boisterous, capricious, and aims to achieve pleasure by getting their wants and needs regardless of the consequences. The superego originates interpersonally from an internalized moral code and social ideas and is guided by constant self-observation. Freud believed that the superego reflected the parents' morality, and that's how a child learned the ways they should behave and think. And that's what the superego represents, a moral compass censoring all inappropriate behavior and making sure that it is in check. And the ego, poor ego, is ruled by the reality principle and mediates between the external world, the id, and the superego. So it's almost like the guy in between trying to avoid the id and the superego fighting between each other. These three structures exist in a state of tension or intrapsychic conflict with one another. And this is because the id and superego function under opposing premises, where the id only wants to fulfill its instinctual drives and the superego wants to censor them. And we can see on the right that the id function at an unconscious level, the superego predominantly at an unconscious level, and the ego at a conscious level. Now, the conflict between these structures is inescapable, produces internal division, generates anxiety, creates the unconscious, and makes us susceptible to psychopathology. And this is because the tension between keeping our instinctual drives in check and not becoming devoid of pleasure in life is in constant battle for controlling our psychic energy. And I say not becoming devoid of pleasure because then that means the superego will be overseeing everything and almost preventing everything or every fulfilling of our instinctual wishes and drives. In the case of either the id or superego dominating this tension, this conflict, psychopathology arises. For example, an obsessive or neurotic person may be predominantly guided by the superego, and a narcissist or a psychopath may be predominantly guided by the id. Now let's move into how anxiety is seen within the context of psychoanalysis, or within the context of the Freudian theoretical perspective. Anxiety is a state of fearful anticipation of external or internal threats resulting from repressed feelings, memories, desires, and experiences threatening to emerge into conscious awareness. And it's interesting because in the psychoanalytic perspective, a triangle of conflict arises explaining the emergence or mitigation of anxiety and the mechanisms by which conscious experiences are suppressed and moved into the unconscious. So the triangle of conflict represents a conflict between the id, ego, and superego, where there is a threat of unconscious desires, feelings, and experiences becoming conscious. And ego defenses are, aiding to the help to reduce the arising anxiety. And all of these ideas take us to talking about the ego defense mechanisms. Now, the ego defense mechanisms protect us from anxiety and internal conflict by restricting our conscious perception of the conflict. This is because they prevent us from having to deal with the conflict arising between the ego, id, and superego. For example, if someone bullies us and we can't defend against the bully, we may point our anger and frustration towards our dog, who is an easy target and will probably not complain back. And interestingly, ego defense mechanisms are mostly unconscious strategies that distort reality and accurate self-awareness. In the therapy relationship, defenses manifest as unconscious resistance to the therapeutic process. And this may happen when clients face a too painful memory or too difficult memory or very difficult thoughts to deal with. For example, someone may not have spoken to their lab brother for the last few years since their last fight. They may rationalize their pain and shame by saying that they weren't really that close with their brother anyway, they didn't care that much, they didn't talk to them. So it's really painful that they are not able to talk to the brother, but they rationalize it, or this defense mechanism kicks into gear to prevent the the large conflict between the id, ego, and superego. The defenses employed depend on the individual's personality, intensity of intrapsychic conflict, and level of anxiety. And the defense mechanisms can be immature, neurotic, or mature. In immature or primitive defenses, there is a considerable distortion of reality. For example, someone diagnosed with cancer may be in denial of the disease and not seek treatment. So we can see how he's completely distorting reality, thinking, I don't have anything, and perhaps, very likely, they will end up dying faster because they don't seek treatment. Now, in neurotic defense mechanisms, there is an intermediate distortion of reality. For example, someone who was abused at the age of 8 may not have memory of the event. And finally, in mature defense mechanisms, there is no distortion of reality. For example, using humor to laugh at one's mistakes. We will have an interesting exercise where you'll have the opportunity to learn more about defense mechanisms in the live tutorials this week. So hopefully you'll get to learn a little bit about the different examples of defense mechanisms and see if you can put that into practice and maybe identify your own defense mechanisms. Alright, let's now move on to the psychosexual stages of development. A significant contribution to psychoanalysis is Freud's psychosexual stages of development, where sexual refers to any form of sensuous, physical, pleasure or gratification. Again, sexual here does not mean sexual activity, but Freud used this term to refer to gratifying the senses or gratifying the zones related to the specific stages of psychosexual development. Freud proposed 5 sequential stages in the developmental process, beginning in infancy. To transition comfortably from one stage to the next, the child must be neither over-gratified or deprived, either of which could result in fixation at that stage. You might have heard about being fixated in one of the psychosexual developmental stages, and this is exactly what Freud meant. So over-gratifying or deprivation in each of these stages, which we will see seen in the next few slides, will result in fixation. Freud contended that the first 6 years of life form the foundation upon which later personality development is built. So again, this is why the idea of early childhood experiences are so important in the Freudian conceptualization of psychopathology. Each stage is named after the erogenous zone it is associated with, and which provides the child with the most stimulation and pleasure during the stage. And here we've got the first 2 psychosexual stages of development. The first one is called the oral stage, and the age range is from 0 to 18 months. Here the characteristics are around infantile pleasure, focused on the mouth, sucking, biting, chewing and swallowing, and that's what provides erotic pleasure as well as nourishment. And that's why we talk about the oral stage, because it's all about being breastfed, it's all about being held by the mother during that young age, being able to receive care and love from the one that is supposed to be looking after the baby. Later personality problems arising from oral fixation can be in relation to trust, rejection, self-esteem, fear, or difficulty forming close relationships, addictive behaviors, and eating disorders. So again, you can see how during this stage, the first year and a half of life, the baby is supposed to be fed, is supposed to be looked after, is supposed to be loved and cared for by the mother, the father, or the carer. And failing to do so can develop in this idea of fixation in this stage, later in adulthood. And again, you can imagine how, for example, trust, rejection, or self-esteem can be a few issues for someone if they didn't get that love from the parents during those early experiences in life. We can also see an interesting concept here about eating disorders. And the idea here is that Freud conceptualized or associated the possibility of anorexia in terms of being fixated in the oral stage. Now, nowadays, these ideas may be a little bit disputed or not accepted as openly as it could have been many years before. And now other elements will be considered in terms of understanding, for example, anorexia or bulimia nervosa. However, you can see how Freud was making this connection given the oral stage and the pleasure or lack of pleasure, lack of satisfaction of the erogenous zone, in this case the oral or the mouth, be associated with eating disorders. So that's one of the things that sometimes nowadays is being a little bit criticized in terms of Freud's theoretical perspective. The second stage is the anal stage, and that is from the 18 months to 3 years of the child. This stage is all about potty training or toilet training. So as toilet training occurs, the anal zone becomes highly significant in the formation of personality. Main development tasks include learning independence, control and expressing negative feelings. Parental discipline patterns and attitudes have significant consequences for later development. So here we see again the interrelation between the child, the agency, the ability to control or not so much something, the ability to master something as potty training or toilet training, and the parental style, whether the parents are disciplining the child too much, or maybe they are letting the child do whatever they want to do, in relation to, again, behaving in a certain way or doing certain things that in a way they're supposed to be doing. For example, here, again, going to the toilet and getting a lot of, for example, a parent that may be really high in terms of discipline, maybe the child is getting a lot of anxiety and expectations in terms of achieving that or mastering that potty training. And later personality problems can be around control, dependence, and maybe being a little bit over controlling or over dependent. And here we see two interesting concepts, anal retentive and anal expulsive, being proposed by Freud. In today's vernacular, you might have heard people talking about anal retentive person or anal expulsive person. And you can see that anal retentive will be organized, clean, and particular. And the problem is when there's a fixation or there's too much emphasis on absolutely following this discipline and you need to master potty training at this age, you can become obsessed with being really organized or very absolutely clean, or having to clean all the time. And the opposite can be said about anal expulsive people, personality types, being messy, disorganized, or chaotic. Now, this is what Freud proposed. Again, nowadays it's not as simple as this. We are not exclusively focusing on whether someone achieve or satisfied the needs during this stage, and if they didn't, then they're fixated in this stage for the rest of their life, and that is why they're really conscientious or neurotic and so on and so forth. It's not as simple as that, and there are many other things to consider now. Now we've got a more anti-deterministic perspective in terms of what are the life experiences and what are the other elements in your life that may take you to a certain place to be in a certain way. However, we can see, we have to give some merit to this theory. We can see how it can have an effect on the child and the personality. The next stage is the phallic stage. This happens between the ages of 3 and 6 years old. Here the child begins to experiment and receive pleasure from genital stimulation. Basic conflict arises from unconscious desires the child develops for the parent of the opposite sex. These are repressed due to their threatening nature. And this is where we see the emergence of the Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex is a combination of sexual and aggressive wishes and feelings of jealousy directed towards parental figures. Now, Freud initially conceptualized the idea of the Oedipus complex in relation to the boy, suddenly realizing of the phallus, and that is why we talk about the phallic stage. And having this tool at their disposal and learning to understand what is the implication and meaning. And that is why we talk about fighting with the father for the love of the mother. Suddenly the child feels empowered with the acknowledgement of the phallus and wants to take the place of the father. However, this involves inappropriate behavior in terms of being aggressive towards the father, because you're supposed to be respecting and loving your father, and being involved romantically with the mother, because you're supposed to be loving your mother, but not necessarily romantically. So you can see how there's an ambivalence and, again, conflict between the instinctual wishes, aggression and sexual drive, and between the id, ego and superego, between the things that are okay and are not okay. The id here is present saying, well, you have to annihilate the father and conquer the love of the mother, whereas the superego is saying, this is completely wrong, this is unacceptable. It should be repressed, it should be suppressed, it should be pushed outside of conscious awareness. So Freud here presents a really interesting dynamic embedded within the idea of the Oedipus complex. Now, how parents respond to a child's emerging sexuality impacts their capacity for Oedipal resolution. And the idea here of Oedipal resolution is being able to resolve or successfully resolve the Oedipus complex. Later personality problems involve sexual difficulties and conflicts, problems with competition, relationship with authority figures, jealousy and shame. And we can see how being able to symbolically conquer the love of the mother with an overly permissive father may have interesting consequences for the child, where the child may think, well, I can get away with anything I want, the world is at my feet, I am almighty, because I already conquered the love of my mother and I annihilated the competition in my father. So you can see how they may have problems with competition, with authority figures, and jealousy. Then we've got the latency stage. This is from 6 to 12 years old. After the torment of sexual impulses in the preceding years, this period is relatively inactive. The child represses sexual instincts, also called libido, and sublimates the energy, that is, converts the energy into non-sexual activities, for example, school, sport, and friendships. The child interacts and plays mostly with same-sex peers because of almost being disgusted by intersex interactions. Now, there's a couple of things to talk about here. So one thing is the idea of sexual instinct in the form of libido. During the previous stage, the child was intending or learning what to do with that psychic energy in terms of the sexual instinct and the libido, and quickly learned that it's not appropriate to conquer the love of the mother and fight with the father for the love of the mother. So repressed and turned inwards all of that sexual instinct. Quickly understood that it's not okay to show overtly all of these sexual instincts. So the idea is to sublimate the energy. Sublimation is a way of saying, because it's something that is not appropriate, specifically in relation to sexual tension or sexual energy, I can't express it in society openly because it's not okay. So then I need to direct or redirect energy into something that is socially sanctioned, such as school, sports, or friendships. So if I can't express all of this energy into something that is not okay, according to societal standards, then I need to find an appropriate outlet for expressing all of this energy. And finally, we've got the genital stage. This is from puberty to adulthood. This phase begins with the onset of puberty and continues through to old age. Adolescents direct their sexual urges onto peers, with the primary focus of pleasure being genital stimulation. Oedipal conflicts becomes reawakened. And this is really interesting because if there's unresolved Oedipal issues, perhaps there's a little bit of jealousy, a little bit of shame within the couple, within the adolescent couples. The internalized social restrictions and taboos redirect sexual energy towards socially acceptable interests and activities. Once more, we see the idea of sublimating these unacceptable sexual urges into more socially acceptable activities. So let's now focus on the therapeutic goals of psychoanalysis. One of the primary goals of psychoanalysis is to help clients gain self-insight and the resolution of intrapsychic conflict. Once more, by making inroads into the unconscious, the client's repressed material emerges to their conscious awareness, and by making the unconscious conscious, they are able to gain insight into their behavior. Another goal of psychoanalysis is to strengthen the client's ego so that their behavior is more based on reality and less on instinctual cravings. You may remember that the ego mediates the conflict between the id and the superego, and by helping clients develop a healthier ego, their behavior responds less to wishes and desires and more to the reality principle. Because psychoanalysis tends to be longer term than CBT, there is an emphasis on the exploration of the unconscious. And when unconscious material surfaces, childhood experiences are discussed and interpreted in relation to these. Psychoanalysis is not limited to solving problems and learning new behavior, but it also focuses on deeper emotional and intellectual insight and self-understanding. And once self-understanding takes place, clients can acquire freedom to love, work, and play. Now, let's move into the function and role of the psychoanalytic therapist. The function and role of the psychoanalyst involves maintaining an analytic attitude. Maintaining an analytic attitude means to try deliberately to get a stance of non-judgmental curiosity and acceptance of every aspect of the client. This facilitates self-acceptance and moderation of a punitive superego. The idea is that if the psychoanalyst proposes a space where there is acceptance, then the superego is mitigated, or the influence of the superego is mitigated, and the client or the analysand hopefully will develop self-acceptance and ego strength. The psychoanalyst also aims to foster a transference relationship. By avoiding self-disclosure and remaining neutral, the client unconsciously relieves conflicted early relationship with the analyst, and it provides a propitious environment for the unconscious materials to emerge and be analyzed. The psychoanalyst invites the client's free associations and explores unconscious links between seemingly unconnected thoughts and feelings. In other words, the analyst not only facilitates free associations, but also listens for and interprets unconscious verbal and non-verbal communications, defenses and resistance to acknowledging unconscious wishes and feelings. Now let's have a quick overview of some of the techniques used within the psychoanalysis context. Psychoanalysis has traditionally employed several techniques, and here are some of the main ones. We can think of maintaining the analytic attitude, free association, interpretation of preconscious and unconscious, dream analysis, analysis of resistance, and analysis of transference. Let's start by looking at maintaining the analytic attitude. This is all about the analyst maintaining relative anonymity, neutrality, objectivity, regularity, consistency of meetings, starting and ending sessions on time, clarity on fees, and boundary issues. We already mentioned that in psychoanalysis, the therapist will usually refrain from sharing personal experiences to foster transference. And we talked about transference. We said it was this idea of putting what 𝓃𝒶𝑜'𝓈 called a blank canvas, so people can transfer their feelings or the ways of relating with the world to the psychoanalyst. And if that happens, then the psychoanalyst will be able to identify that and interpret that for the client. So the idea here is that the psychoanalyst also needs to show neutrality and objectivity. And these are to avoid passing judgment on clients' actions. What is the main purpose of this? This is similar to PCT, person-centered approach, from Carl Rogers. So the idea is to provide empathy and an understanding space to allow clients to lower their defenses and feel more at ease and start engaging in the free association process. But then it's also really important to maintain consistency of meetings, whether that's on a weekly basis or a fortnightly basis or 3 times a week, but it has to be always at the same time, with a clear duration, clear expectations, clear fees, clear ending time, and always the same process. In fact, I learned this in my own practice because sometimes, depending on the level of needs that a child might have, I would be altering the sessions and I will be, I guess, doing a triaging process and say, well, this child doesn't really need to see me every week right now. And sometimes, either because of a public holiday or whatever is the reason, it may end up that I didn't see the child for 3 weeks. And then that connection, that relationship, that understanding, it was slightly lost. And it takes time to rebuild that connection. Now, in terms of free association, we can say that free association is a fundamental rule of analysis, where clients say any thoughts that enter their minds without self-censorship, regardless of how embarrassing, silly, trivial, illogical, or irrelevant they may seem. This is a basic tool to explore unconscious wishes, fantasies, conflicts, and motivation, and it often leads to recollection of repressed memories, experiences, and release of intense blocked feelings. Now, something that is really interesting to talk about here is the couch. So when we think about Freud and think about psychoanalysis, probably most of us imagine the idea of sitting on a couch and talking to a therapist. So if you pay attention in these prototypical representations, the psychoanalyst will usually be sitting behind the client or behind the analysand, and will usually be facing other way, looking at some other part of the room. The client will be facing not towards the analyst, but the other way, facing, for example, towards the wall. This was done on purpose to try and facilitate the idea of free association, to try and facilitate the idea of jumping from one thought to another thought without feeling judged, without feeling that someone was observing the client or someone was censoring the client. Nowadays, this has changed. Maybe there are some analysts that are still using the couch in this sense, but nowadays things have evolved, and we usually look at the typical office, the counseling space, where there is maybe 2 chairs and the client and the therapist are facing each other. But you can see how this idea of the couch and looking away could really facilitate the idea of free association. Another important technique within the psychoanalysis context is interpretation of preconscious and unconscious content. This is when the therapist points out and clarifies unconsciously disguised meanings of relations, behaviors, dreams, free associations, etc. The therapist will start from the surface of awareness and work deeper, using the client's reaction as a gauge to their readiness to accept the therapist's interpretation. So here's the thing. Sometimes the problem is that the interpretations will come as a bucket of cold water for the client because their behavior and even what they say may be completely outside of the conscious awareness. And suddenly to be confronted with an aspect of themselves completely unknown for the client can be quite challenging. That is why we say start from the surface of awareness and then work deeper. Another really interesting technique is dream analysis. Dream analysis is really important to uncover and decode unconscious material. Freud believed that most dream content will be a manifestation of unconscious content because during sleep, the defenses are lowered and repressed feelings surface. He also believed that dreams have two levels of content. The latent level involves the hidden symbolic and unconscious motives, wishes and fears that are threatening and are transformed into more seemingly obscure dream content. And the second one is manifest content. This is where the dream is as it appears to the dreamer. And the process by which the latent content is transformed into the manifest content is called dream work. Another technique we can discuss is analysis of resistance. Resistance involves anything that works against the therapy process and prevents the clients from accessing and understanding unconscious material. This can include things like ideas, feelings, attitudes, actions, etc. For example, the therapist may identify a hesitation, a pause, or a silence, and may reflect on the possibility of resistance by saying something like, "It seems like you were going to say something, and you pause. I wonder what was going through your mind at that stage." Because resistance has a defensive function, it impedes self-insight and prevents resolution of the unconscious conflict, causing and maintaining psychopathology. Again, the idea is try to identify glimpses of resistance and reflect that back to the client so the client becomes aware of where these resistant points are, and perhaps they may start developing self-insight or self-knowledge and insight to understand what are the roots of the problems that are maintaining and developing psychopathology. And finally, we can talk about analysis of transference. Through interpretation, clients can see repetitive patterns in their relationships with others. It enables clients to work through the effects of early relationships in the current therapeutic relationship. And it also works to increase client awareness and disrupting maladaptive relationship patterns. Finally, we can briefly talk about some strengths and weaknesses of psychoanalysis. While there may be some controversies around Freud's theories and perspective, psychoanalytic theory continues to evolve and new scholars reinterpret different aspects of Freud's original theories. This usually results in more context-appropriate adjustments of Freud's conceptualizations, making psychoanalysis very relevant and prominent in today's counseling. It also involved the exploration of avoidance and resistance, which can help clients expand their insight and conscious awareness, making significant progress. Another strength is that there is an emphasis in early childhood experiences and the roots of symptomatology. This arguably helps clients understand the causes of the symptoms and be able to have longer-term gains. However, there are also some weaknesses we can briefly mention. For example, it is a lengthy treatment that may not be affordable for many clients. Imagine having to do therapy 2 or 3 times a week for a few years. So you can see how many resources clients should invest in this therapeutic approach and how sometimes some clients may not be able to afford it or may not have the motivation to engage in such a lengthy process. Another limitation or weakness we can identify is that it is a non-directive and unstructured approach that differs from typical helping relationships. And for that very reason, it may not appeal to different cultures or social groups. So once more, imagine that you go to therapy and the therapist, or in this case a psychoanalyst, doesn't say much, doesn't give you any direction or any structure whatsoever. It can be off-putting for certain people. And finally, psychoanalysis confronts people with painful, embarrassing and shameful aspects of themselves, which requires courage, requires strength and tolerance. So we talk about courage because sometimes all of these parts of the self have been repressed for so many years and are so painful that you actually need to have courage and ego strength to face, to put yourself through that process and endure it. And that's all we had to say about psychoanalysis. Once more, this is not such a condensed version anymore. This video went on for a whole hour, but there is way more to explore many aspects here that are just briefly concise, and I will strongly encourage you to expand the knowledge we're providing here in this brief overview. We will put some interesting links on Canvas for you to explore a little bit more, and we will be happy to receive any questions you may have in this topic. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you find it useful, and we'll see you in the next video.